Taoiseach, welcome to Ireland Unfiltered. It's very nice to have you here.
Oh, my pleasure.
Before we really get into it, I'm actually just struck by your emblem on your suit there. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this here, it's the shamrock poppy. So it's made by the British Legion in Ireland, and it's sort of a modified version of the poppy. The poppy, as you know, applies to anyone who died fighting for Britain in any war, including recent wars like Iraq, for example, which we would have had no part in. But this is a specific one that they've done to allow us to remember Irish people who died fighting for the United Kingdom, which of course we were part of in the First World War. And this weekend, as you know, is the centenary of the armistice. So something I wore last year, and I'm wearing this year as well.
And is that important, especially this year, to wear it when 35,000 people, Irish people, died in that war? I think.
Yeah, I think it's particularly important this year because of the centenary, but I also think it's important every year. You know, a few times in our history, or a few times through the course of Irish history, we've kind of reinvented our history, and I think now that we've a decent distance from that period, we can perhaps be a little bit more honest about it. So I think by understanding our shared history, we help to breed understanding, but it's not designed to challenge anyone's loyalty. So if you think about it, if you go back to the First World War, a lot of the Irish people who fought in that war fought on the same side. There would have been Protestants or Unionists from Northern Ireland, also would have been a lot of Catholics from the southern part of Ireland, who at that time believed in Home Rule. But Home Rule would have meant staying in the British Empire. And I think it's just useful for us as a country to acknowledge the complexity of our history, that for a long period of time, Ireland was very much part of the empire, was very much part of the imperial enterprise, occupying places like India, for example. Irish people on my mum's side occupied my dad's country as British people, even though they're from Ireland. And I just think it's always useful for us to experience our shared history in a way that helps us to understand it better, but as I said before, not in a way that attempts to question anyone's loyalties.
Are you concerned about that at the moment because of Brexit and things like that shared history, that there is a rupture between Ireland and Britain?
Yeah, very much so. I think anything that pulls Britain and Ireland apart, and anything that pulls the two communities of Northern Ireland apart, is moving backwards. So much has been done in the past 20 or 30 years to improve relations between Britain and Ireland, and relations between the two communities in particular in Northern Ireland. But I think moments like the armistice, the 11th of November, allows us to remember that we shed blood together.
But can that transcend what's happening at the moment? Because it does seem to be getting more and more fraught. Like, I'm interested in, from your point of view, like, I imagine one of the most difficult, confusing aspects of your job at the moment is knowing what Britain thinks about Brexit on any given day. Because, today, Monday, it's one thing, maybe tomorrow it's going to be something else. Like, how do you keep on top of something like that, which is so critical to Ireland's interests?
Yeah, well, I suppose I'm very conscious that in Britain and the United Kingdom there are still very different views on Brexit. But my job, obviously, as Taoiseach, is to interact with the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister, Theresa May, speaks on behalf of the UK government. Actually spoke to her today on the phone and told her I was wearing this. And I just thought it was apt in many ways. So it was coincidental but apt, because what I am trying to do, and what we're both trying to do, is to marry the two traditions, the shamrock, which is Ireland, the poppy, which in many ways is British, and come to some sort of understanding or some sort of agreement that can work for both countries. But
you say she speaks for Britain, but Dominic Raab seemed to be speaking for Britain. There was a Sunday Times story where lots of people seem to be speaking for Britain and talking about, we can curse on this programme, fucking Ireland. Like, that isn't helpful to getting a settlement that Ireland requires in this, is it?
Yeah, it's not, but to be honest, I tend to disregard a lot of what I read in the media around Brexit, particularly from the British press. And the person that I deal with is the Prime Minister, and over the course of the past few months, I think we're getting to a place where potentially I can see a landing zone for a withdrawal agreement, including an Irish protocol, the backstop, which satisfies what we need as a country, but also is one that she'll be able to get through Westminster and get through her own government.
Do you think that can happen? Because you talked today about it being a divided kingdom. Like, do you think there's any need in Britain for something like the people's vote, where they actually make a decision on the terms of the deal rather than on the vague leave or remain vote that they had in 2016?
Yeah, I think that has to be up to them. I totally regret the fact that a small majority of people in the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. I regret that they made that decision, but we have to respect it. That's the way democracy works. If they decide to have a second referendum, that's very much up to them. But one thing I'm very careful not to do is in any way to say anything that might suggest that I'm telling them to do that. Because.
But you would be happy if Britain was staying in the European Union?
Oh yeah, of course. I think the European Union is going to be a lesser place without the UK. It's a major economy. It's still a significant power in the world, and the European Union without the UK is going to be a lesser place, and that's a pity. Global power in the world, global economic power is shifting to the east and shifting to the south. I think by 2050, I remember reading that maybe only 7% of the world's population will be in Europe, probably only 10-15% of the world's economy. I compare that to 100 years ago when the European countries were dominant in the world. And if we're going to hold our own in negotiations and competition with China and India and America, we're going to need to stick together if we want to preserve our European values, our European way of life, and advance our values around liberal democracy, for example, and multilateralism. Europe needs to stick together, and unfortunately the decision of the UK to leave weakens Europe, but they have made that decision, and just because they're leaving doesn't mean that we are, and we're going to continue to be at the heart of the European Union, a project that we've helped to build over the past 40 years.
On domestic issues, then, if you like, when you did the budget, or when the budget was announced, you said you were preparing for Brexit and things like that. But today you've talked about our figures have been released about parental leave and stuff like that, and there's been a great take up on that over the last 2 years. Was it 50,000, more than 50,000?
Yeah, that's paternity leave. Yeah, so I had the privilege as Minister for Social Protection to see that through and bring it through, and that gives young dads 2 weeks leave and 2 weeks paid leave, in fact, to spend a bit of time with their kids when they're born, and we want to expand that. So what we're going to do towards the end of next year is bring in parental leave, which is slightly different to paternity leave, and what that is essentially is additional time that either parent can take off in the first year of their child's life. So it's at the moment maternity leave and paternity leave can't be shared, but this new parental leave
can be shared.
And again, it's actually something that's coming down the line from Europe. We're just getting ahead of it, but it's really part of an effort by government to make life a little bit easier for families. And there's other ways that we've done that, whether it's the 2 years free preschool, which I think a lot of people value, or the fact that we're bringing in more and more subsidies for childcare. So about 80,000 kids now benefit from subsidised childcare, and when we bring in the next set of reforms next year, even people on middle incomes, couples earning up to 100,000 will qualify for childcare subsidies. And when I think of the people getting up early in the morning to drop the kids off to creche, I want them to know that government is there to help. It's not the role of government to bring up people's kids for them, and nobody really expects that, but it is the role of government to help, and this is one of the ways that we can help.
Do you regret talking about people who get up early in the morning? Because it seems to follow you around, and I noticed at the weekend even you were kind of saying, well, I wasn't the first person to say it. Yeah,
I definitely wasn't. I think Nicolas Sarkozy, when he ran for president of France, used the term. I'm sure it's been used before. It's not my personal property. No matter what you do in politics, there are always people who will misrepresent what you say or will use what you say against you. I don't mind that. That's the game we're in. But when I talk about it, it's something that I really believe in. Because I believe that if we want our society to work, we have to reward those people who work and make things possible, who run our public services, who run our private sector, who pay taxes, who enable us to live in what is one of the best countries in the world, quite frankly. I know it doesn't feel like that sometimes, but out of the 200 countries in the world, Ireland is one of the best ones you can live in. But you have to have a social contract which says to people who, do work hard, who do obey the law, who play by the rules, who pay their taxes, that there's something in it for them as well. And that means reducing their taxes when we can afford to do so they can keep more of their own money. It means making sure that they also benefit from public services, whether it's education or health or childcare. And that's very much my vision of where I want to bring the country to.
When you talk about that in the social contract, people would look at something like housing and wonder what the social contract is doing there. Like you described it as a national emergency. I'm interested in what you mean when you say that.
Yeah, well, I've heard people demanding on a number of occasions that we describe it as a crisis, and then after that demanded that we describe it as an emergency. And I've no difficulty describing it as a crisis or an emergency, but neither of those things help to solve the problem. But when I talk about it being in terms of emergency, what I mean is that it causes us to do things and make policy decisions that we wouldn't in normal times have considered. So say, for example, the rent pressure zones, the rent caps, the maximum increase of 4%, that would have been heresy, I think, 5 or 10 years ago to suggest that in Ireland we'd interfere with the market in that way and bring in rent controls. And then, for example, the fact that we've brought in, which is really going to start kicking in over the next year or so, the vacant site tax, to say to somebody that if you have a vacant site, you have to use it. Moving away from this idea that it's private property and it's yours to use or not use, we're now saying that this is a housing emergency and you have to use it, and if not, we're going to tax you.
But are you doing enough within that? What would have to happen for you? You say you've had some radical ideas. What would have to change for you to decide that, well, the market and private, and developers and that aspect of things need to be taken out of doing a lot of the heavy lifting of the housing market? Like, what would have to change for you to decide that it's a real emergency, if you like, that it's when you describe it as a national emergency, it seems to me you're still wedded to a certain philosophy on how to approach it.
Not quite sure what you mean by that. I hear people say that sometimes, but I'm not entirely sure what they mean. I don't quite know what you mean. But
well, I think you look at the private rental market. If you talk to people in the housing sector, they'll say that the private rental market still does an awful lot of the heavy lifting. People who are in emergency accommodation, a lot of them are there because they've lost their homes. That fear of losing your home also informs how people respond to rent increases from landlords, because they're terrified that. I was talking to somebody in the housing sector today who said, we talk to people who are frightened to get repairs done in their house because they feel the landlord is going to, they don't want to draw attention to themselves. Like, that seems to be an extreme way of living for people who are, who get up early in the morning, who have this kind of great uncertainty hanging around them about, the very basics of, where they're going to live.
Yeah, but I don't accept the ideological charge. But let me explain what I mean by that. To solve this very real problem that we have, the first thing we have to do is drive supply. We have a population that increased by 65,000 last year. So logically, every year we need about 35,000 new homes. This year we'll build about 20,000 new houses and apartments, more than in any year this decade, but still not enough. We need to ramp that up to about 35,000 over the next couple of years, and we're going to do that. And some of that's going to be private build, some of it's going to be social housing, public housing. And I believe we need more social housing and public housing. In fact, this year there'll be about 7,000 additional social housing units added to the stock. But until we build all that social housing, yes, we do rely excessively on private rented accommodation through Rent Up and through HAP and things like that. But roughly the way I would see it is the vast majority of people want to buy their own home, want to own their own home and should be able to. But there's probably about 20-25% of people who, for one reason or another, never will be able to. And that's the kind of level of social housing or public housing we need to have in the country, around 20-25%. At the moment, it's only 10. So over the next decade, we're going to need to build probably about 100,000, or at least provide about 110,000 more social housing units. And that's exactly what we intend to do. So I think that's just common sense. I don't see anything ideological with that. What I do see is other people who are ideological, particularly people on the left, who think that the only type of housing that we should build is social housing, and there's only one way to deliver it, which is direct build by local authorities. That's what I see as being a hardline ideology. Like this morning I was opening a housing project in Dublin 9, and there's 42 units, 150 people going to be moving in there. It was built as a partnership involving a housing trust and Dublin City Council. But those kind of hardline ideological left-wing people say that doesn't count because it wasn't built directly by the council. But the people living there don't think that way.
So you see yourself as a pragmatist, and the people who oppose you are ideologues.
Yeah, I think they're the ones who are the ideologues, and actually, ironically, a lot of these are people who will declare themselves as being radical socialists, and yet they accuse a government that is just trying to do everything we can to solve the problem as being ideological. I actually think what would happen if they were in charge is they would pursue that extreme ideology. Only direct build, only social housing, and actually what you'd see for the first 5 or 10 years is a fall off in building because the councils just don't have the capacity to build housing at the rate that we need it.
But in the past, in the 50s and 70s, those kind of social housing projects were undertaken in Ireland.
Yeah.
Why can't those things be done again?
Because we're not in the 50s or 60s, and what you had then was a very different setup. You had local authorities that essentially were builders themselves. To build up that kind of capacity in our local authorities, I don't know how long it would take, but it would take so long that we would definitely make this crisis worse initially and prolong it in the medium term. So when you do have a crisis, when you do have an emergency, what you need to do, in my view, is to build as many houses as quickly as possible by any mechanism you can come up with. And that could be local authorities, and local authorities are building more. It could be housing associations and housing trusts like the Ivy Trust that build houses in this city for as long as I can remember, and certainly before you and I were born, or by developers. The ideologues who are saying are the ones who say we should get rid of all of that and pursue this one way of doing it, which is direct builds of social housing by local authorities. And the reality is that if you went down that line of policy, it would take so long to build up the capacity in local authorities to do that again, that the problem would get a lot worse, probably for 5 or 10 years. And even then it mightn't get better.
And how...
but that's their ideology, so the facts don't matter.
Well, if you look at something then specific like homelessness, like, do you think, like the figures are pretty appalling? But yet again, talking to people about this, they say, with real action, those numbers could be reduced. If there was a true will to kind of tackle it, they could be reduced, because it's an appalling situation, whatever way you deliver housing, that, one of the legacies you're going to have is that people will grow up under your government having spent their childhood in emergency accommodation, the damage that's going to do to people. Surely that involves taking action that actually, is different, is radical.
And I'd argue that we're doing that. Take, for example, rough sleeping. This time last year, certainly 18 months ago, there's a huge focus on the number of people who were rough sleeping in this city, in Dublin. That's down about 40%. And why is it down 40%? Because we pursued this housing first model. Getting people off the streets into housing, but wrapping a lot of different supports around them, working with the NGOs to do this, so they don't lose the accommodation they're in, because often people who are rough sleeping have a lot of other problems, mental health problems, addiction problems, and so on, and that has been very successful. If you take the number of people who are in emergency accommodation, which is in the region of around 10,000 now, we took 5,000 people out of emergency accommodation this year. Unfortunately, there are more people coming in. And because of the whole family hubs, and again, a huge investment has gone into family hubs, the average time that somebody spends in emergency accommodation is now 6 months. So children there are extreme cases, of course, and exceptional cases, but children aren't growing up in emergency accommodation. The average time you would spend in a family hub is 6 months. I appreciate for various reasons there are exceptions. In some cases, people have been offered housing and have refused it. You'll always have a certain number of exceptions. But they're the kind of things we're doing. I know it's not enough. I know we haven't turned the corner yet. But I think when we get the supply going, when we get to the point where we're building enough new homes and apartments every year to meet or exceed demand, then we'll really be able to get on top of that issue.
And you think you're doing enough? Because, like, again, it does seem, I know you'll say it's these radical socialists who are wedded to an ideology, but like it does seem that again you feel that you can kind of just stick to a plan that you have rather than saying this is a generational crisis. And like Dunkirk was an emergency, and people didn't say let's schedule another ferry. They did something drastic, and people look at what the government is doing and think drastic action isn't being taken to get these people out of emergency accommodation.
I'm not sure I said we're doing enough. I think we need to do more, but there are limitations on what you can do. Take, for example, the budget that we just passed a week or two ago. That provides for a 25% increase in public investment in housing next year. That's a pretty big increase. Some people would say, oh, you should increase it by 50% or 100%. But that doesn't actually necessarily mean that you would build more houses, because there are real constraints. Land has to be serviced. There's a limited amount of concrete in the country. There's a limited number of construction workers. Because of the mistakes that were made 10 years ago, we saw a construction industry collapse, a banking sector collapse, and we're still recovering from that. And the solutions that I see other people putting forward, they may sound radical, but where's the evidence that they would work any quicker? Like, are you really saying to me that you can just turn around and write a letter to Wicklow County Council and tell them to build 2,000 houses? Like, that's fantasy land.
Well, I'm interested in you saying that because, like, there was a point where Owen Murphy talked about taking powers back from the local authorities, and so again, somebody used the term "a battle of wills" to me when I was talking to him about this between the housing department and local authorities. Like, what is that seems to be, not just in housing, but maybe even in HSE and the Department of Health, maybe to do with the guards and justice, that there seems to be these battles of wills, and it affects ordinary people at the end of the day. And is that good? Like, when you look at that, I'm interested not so much in, like, we could sit here talking about the right way of doing it, but when you look at that, how do you look at analyze that and think we can solve this and make this government work more effectively for people?
I think, as is always the case in any big organisation, and government is huge and has many arms and many different wings, that from time to time you're going to have tensions or disagreements. In much smaller organisations, I guarantee you, there are battles of will and disagreements, and you just have to manage them. And essentially, when it comes to housing, let's not forget that housing under law is actually supposed to be a function of local authorities, but central government has had to step in more and more in order to get things done. And some councils are doing really well. My own council area, which is Fingal and North Dublin, there's a building boom underway. Others have been much slower to the game. And really what Minister Murphy, I think, is trying to do is to drive performance, to say to some local authorities, compare yourself with the one next door. How come they're doing so much better than you, even though they have the same laws and the same resources? And that applies in healthcare as well. You'll see a huge variation one hospital to the next, even though the staff are paid the same. All the rules and regulations are the same, but some deliver much better.
It was put to me that local authorities think they can kind of sit out a housing minister. I think there's been 6 in 7 years or something like that. So they feel that they just need to kind of sit tight, and this minister will be gone, and a new one will come in with his plans, and we'll start from square one again. Like, is that something you need to kind of consider in the carousel of politics? Maybe you should make Owen Murphy minister for life.
Well, I think ultimately it's a matter for the public voting as to who decides who's in power.
But you get that point, though.
I do, and one of the difficulties in policy and in government is if there are constant shifts in policy, that actually makes it hard to get things done. And if all of a sudden, as we discussed earlier, there was a radical shift or change in housing policy towards direct bills by local authorities only, social housing only, as I've tried to explain, actually you may find for the first 5 years the number of new homes drops off, because that radical shift in policy would take so long to get to the point where it can actually deliver that we'd actually end up going backwards.
Can I ask you a little bit about your own journey in a political sense? How would you say your worldview has altered over the years? Like, reading about you, you seem to have had a certain view of the world at quite a young age that maybe would have distinguished you from a lot of other kind of teenagers. Would that be fair?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how many teenagers would have been as interested in politics
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. That's what I'm getting
as I
at.
was. So
Yeah.
I don't know. Look, I think anyone over time, at least I think any thinking person over time will change their minds on things, or reflect on things, and just experience and new facts, I think, cause people to revisit their positions. And I think there's an old adage, I'd be a lot more concerned about people who are 40 or 50 now and believe exactly everything they believed when they were 22 or 23. Like, again, they're the ideologues.
Yeah.
I'm practical. I have values, but I'm not an ideological extremist. Never was.
And ambition as well. Like, we've had a couple of guests on, Ryan Tubridy and Barry Keoghan, in this show already, and where their ambition came from is something that's been kind of one of the themes of the show. You wanted to be, I think you said, you said you wanted to be Minister of Health at a very early age. Like, where did that come from?
My mum tells that story.
Yeah.
I don't remember myself. But I think if that is true, where it probably came from is, my background's medical. My dad's a GP and a doctor, and my mum's ambition for me was to be a doctor like my dad, and my ambition for me was to be a politician. And I probably married the two and came up with that idea. But it's a story she tells now. I don't actually remember it.
But so it wasn't. But then politics was the thing that drove you, but policy more than, like, I remember when we met before then in Cork at the leadership debates, I was kind of struck. I asked you how it was going, and you said something like, "Well, it's quite a strange experience." That was the fourth night, and you were very honest. You kind of said, "This is kind of a strange thing. I'm saying the same thing every night, and I have to remind myself that people are hearing it for the first time." And it wasn't what I expected a politician to say, because and even like we had Ryan Tubridy in. Ryan Tubridy is more of a glad handling politician, and that he worked the room afterwards like he was born to it, which he was in some senses. But like, that was never the bit of politics that appealed to you.
Yeah, and some people say I'm all spin. and actually, and you asked me a straight question, I gave you an honest answer. I could have given you a line. I didn't.
But was that the fact you never found that side of it that engaging?
I've always been interested in politics, even when I was a kid. Interested in elections, very interested in policy, very interested in examining problems and seeing how we can solve them. I suppose I've had to learn the other element of politics, which is, I don't think glad handing is the term, but the kind of art of politics, sort of going out there, shaking hands, small talk.
Yeah.
Posing for photographs, that type of thing. That didn't come naturally. But my friends and colleagues tell me I've got much better at down the years, but I'm not a natural in that sense.
No. Can I ask you just a couple of quick things? What would a united Ireland look like to you?
I think at the outset, a united Ireland worth having is one whereby people are united. Whereby everyone in the country would feel that they're part of the country, a country in which nobody feels that they've been left out. And that's, one thing I would always think when people talk about, United Ireland in the traditional sense, bringing the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland together into a 32 county state. I would not like to visit on Unionists in Northern Ireland what I believe was visited on Nationalists and Catholics in Northern Ireland. People feeling that this wasn't their state, that they weren't really part of it, that they were bounced into it or left in it against their will. And that's why, notwithstanding the difficulties in the last year or two of Brexit, I always try to be very sensitive to that fact that there is a different tradition on our island, a different nationality, people who feel themselves to be British, and they are British, and we need to respect that. And I don't think if we ever had United Ireland into the future, that it could be just a bit like East Germany and West Germany, the Republic taking over the North.
So it would require more than just a population shift or majority shift in Northern Ireland.
I know what the Good Friday Agreement says, and I'm one of the co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement. I stand by that agreement, and that says that if in a referendum 50% plus one person in Northern Ireland voted for a united Ireland, that would then come about. I wouldn't like it to come about that way. If it ever does come about, I'd like to come about in such a way that you'd have a strong, as much as possible anyway, cross-community support for it. The Good Friday Agreement was adopted by 97% of people, I think, voting here south of the border for it, 71% in Northern Ireland. That's a really strong mandate for a constitutional settlement, and it's one that I think we should try to make work.
I haven't one final thing. I mean, listen to you there speak so eloquently about that. Do you regret the way you've been perceived and portrayed among unionists since Brexit because of that?
I do, and unfortunately that was one of the things that Brexit unleashed. Not just in Northern Ireland, but in Britain as well. Where you see people who are from other European countries who are settled there, all of a sudden starting to feel that this country that they lived in for 20, 30 years doesn't feel like home anymore. And those are the kind of feelings and the kind of emotions that Brexit unfortunately has unleashed, and populism and nationalism has done that across Europe. And I think all we can do is push back and continue to make the case for what I believe we should stand for, which is liberal democracy, which is multilateralism, and the social market economy.
Taoiseach, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.